Jem grinned and pushed his hair back. Just in your own words was Mr. Gilmer's trademark. We often wondered who else's words Mr. Gilmer was afraid his witness might employ. Well, the night of November 21, I was coming in from the woods with a load of kindling, and just as I got to the fence, I heard Mayella screaming like a stuck hog inside the house. Here Judge Taylor glanced sharply at the witness and must have decided his speculation devoid of evil intent, for he subsided sleepily. What time was it, Mr. Ewell? Just 'fore sundown. Well, I was saying Mayella was screaming fit to beat Jesus. Another glance from the bench silenced Mr. Ewell. Yes, she was screaming, said Mr. Gilmer. Mr. Ewell looked confusedly at the judge. Well, Mayella was raising this holy racket, so I dropped my load and run as fast as I could, but I run to the fence. But when I got distangled, I run up to the window and I seen... Mr. Ewell's face grew scarlet. He stood up and pointed his finger at Tom Robinson. I seen that black nigger yonder rutting on my Mayella. So serene was Judge Taylor's court that he had few occasions to use his gavel, but he hammered fully 5 minutes. Atticus was on his feet at the bench saying something to him. Mr. Hectate, as first officer of the county, stood in the middle aisle quelling the packed courtroom. Behind us there was an angry, muffled groan from the colored people. Reverend Sykes leaned across Dill and me, pulling at Jem's elbow. Mr. Jem, he said, you better take Miss Jean Louise home, Mr. Jem, you hear me? Jem turned his head. Scout, go home. Dill, you and Scout go home. You gotta make me first, I said, remembering Atticus's blessed dictum. Jem scowled furiously at me, then said to Reverend Sykes, I think it's okay, Reverend. She doesn't understand it. I was mortally offended. I most certainly do. I can understand anything you can. Ah, hush. She doesn't understand it, Reverend. She ain't 9 yet. Reverend Sykes' black eyes were anxious. Mr. Finch, know you all are here? This ain't fit for Miss Jean Louise or you boys either. Jem shook his head. He can't see us this far away. It's all right, Reverend. I knew Jem would win, because I knew nothing could make him leave now. Dill and I were safe for a while. Atticus could see us from where he was, if he looked. As Judge Taylor banged his gavel, Mr. Ewell was sitting smugly in the witness chair surveying his handiwork. With one phrase, he had turned happy picnickers into a sulky, tense, murmuring crowd, being slowly hypnotized by gavel taps lessening in intensity until the only sound in the courtroom was a dim pink, pink, pink. The judge might have been rapping the bench with a pencil. In possession of his court once more, Judge Taylor leaned back in his chair. He looked suddenly weary. His age was showing, and I thought about what Atticus had said. He and Mrs. Taylor didn't kiss much. He must have been nearly 70. There has been a request, Judge Taylor said, that this courtroom be cleared of spectators, or at least of women and children. A request that will be denied for the time being. People generally see what they look for and hear what they listen for, and they have the right to subject their children to it. But I can assure you of one thing. You will receive what you see and hear in silence, or you will leave this courtroom. But you won't leave it until the whole boiling of you come before me on contempt charges. Mr. Ewell, you will keep your testimony within the confines of Christian English usage, if that is possible. Proceed, Mr. Gilmer. Mr. Ewell reminded me of a deaf mute. I was sure he had never heard the words Judge Taylor directed at him. His mouth struggled silently with them, but their import registered on his face. Smugness faded from it, replaced by a dogged earnestness that fooled Judge Taylor not at all. As long as Mr. Ewell was on the stand, the judge kept his eyes on him, as if daring him to make a false move. Mr. Gilmer and Atticus exchanged glances. Atticus was sitting down again. His fist rested on his cheek, and we could not see his face. Mr. Gilmer looked rather desperate. A question from Judge Taylor made him relax. Mr. Ewell, did you see the defendant having sexual intercourse with your daughter? Yes, I did. The spectators were quiet, but the defendant said something. Atticus whispered to him, and Tom Robinson was silent. You say you were at the window, asked Mr. Gilmer. Yes, sir. How far is it from the ground? About 3 foot. Did you have a clear view of the room? Yes, sir. How did the room look? Well, it was all slung about, like there was a fight. What did you do when you saw the defendant? Well, I run around the house to get in, but he was run out the front door just ahead of me. I sawed who it was, all right. I was too distracted about Mayella to run after him. I run in the house, and she was lying on the floor squalling. Then what did you do? Why, I run for Tate quick as I could. I knowed who it was, all right. Lived down yonder in that nigger nest. Passed the house every day. Judge, I asked this county for 15 years to clean out that nest down yonder. They're dangerous to live around, besides devaluing my property. Thank you, Mr. Ewell, said Mr. Gilmer hurriedly. The witness made a hasty descent from the stand and ran smack into Atticus, who had risen to question him. Judge Taylor permitted the court to laugh. Just a minute, sir, said Atticus genially. Could I ask you a question or two? Mr. Yule backed up to the witness chair, settled himself, and regarded Atticus with haughty suspicion, an expression common to Macomb County witnesses when confronted by opposing counsel. Mr. Yule, Atticus began. Folks were doing a lot of running that night. Let's see. You say you ran to the house, you ran to the window, you ran inside, you ran to Mayella, you ran for Mr. Tate. Did you, during all this running, run for a doctor? Wasn't no need to. I seen what happened. But there's one thing I don't understand, said Atticus. Weren't you concerned with Mayella's condition? I most positively was, said Mr. Yule. I seen who done it. No, I mean her physical condition. Did you not think that the nature of her injuries warranted immediate medical attention? What? Didn't you think she should have a doctor immediately? The witness said he never thought of it. He had never called a doctor to any of his in his life, and if he had, it would have cost him $5. That all? He asked. Not quite, said Atticus casually. Mr. Yule, you heard the sheriff's testimony, didn't you? How's that? You were in the courtroom when Mr. Tate were on the stand, weren't you? You heard everything he said, didn't you? Mr. Yule considered the matter carefully, and seemed to decide that the question was safe. Yes, he said. Do you agree with the description of Mayella's injuries? How's that? Atticus looked around at Mr. Gilmer and smiled. Mr. Yule seemed determined not to give the defense the time of day. Mr. Tate testified that her right eye was blackened, that she was beaten around the... Oh, yeah, said the witness. I hold with everything Tate said. You do? Asked Atticus mildly. I just want to make sure. He went to the court reporter, said something, and the reporter entertained us for some minutes by reading Mr. Tate's testimony, as if it were the stock market quotations. Which eye her left? Oh, yes, that'd make it her right, as it was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember now, she was funked. He flipped the page. Up on that side of the face. Sheriff, please repeat what you said. It was her right eye, I said. Thank you, Bert, said Atticus. You heard it again, Mr. Yule. Do you have anything to add to it? Do you agree with the sheriff? I holds with Tate. Her eye was blacked and she was mighty beat up. The little man seemed to have forgotten his previous humiliation from the bench. It was becoming evident that he thought Atticus an easy match. He seemed to grow ruddy again, his chest swelled, and once more he was a red little rooster. I thought he'd burst his shirt at Atticus's next question. Mr. Yule, can you read and write? Mr. Gilmer interrupted. Objection, he said. Can't see what the witness's literacy has to do with the case. Irrelevant. Immaterial. Judge Taylor was about to speak, but Atticus said, Judge, if you'll allow the question plus another one, you'll soon see. All right, let's see, said Judge Taylor, but make sure we see Atticus. Overruled. Mr. Gilmer seemed as curious as the rest of us as to what bearing the state of Mr. Yule's education had on the case. I'll repeat the question, said Atticus. Can you read and write? I most positively can. Will you write your name and show us? I most positively will. How do you think I sign my relief checks? Mr. Yule was endearing himself to his fellow citizen. The whispers and chuckles below us probably had to do with what a card he was. I was becoming nervous. Atticus seemed to know what he was doing, but it seemed to me that he'd gone frog-sticking without a light. Never, 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 on cross-examination, ask a witness a question you don't already know the answer to. This was a tenet I absorbed with my baby food. Do it, and you'll often get an answer you don't want, an answer that might wreck your case. Atticus was reaching into the inside pocket of his coat. He drew out an envelope, then reached into his vest pocket and unclipped his fountain pen. He moved leisurely, and had turned so that he was in full view of the jury. He unscrewed the fountain pen cap and placed it gently on his table. He shook the pen a little, then handed it with the envelope to the witness. Would you write your name for us? He asked, clearly now so the jury can see you do it. Mr. Yule wrote on the back of the envelope and looked up complacently to see Judge Taylor staring at him as if he were some fragrant gardenia in full bloom on the witness stand, to see Mr. Gilmer, half standing, half sitting, at the table. The jury was watching him. One man was leaning forward with his hands over the railing. What's so interesting? He asked. You're left-handed, Mr. Yule, said Judge Taylor. Mr. Yule turned angrily to the judge and said he didn't see what his being left-handed had to do with it, that he was a Christ-fearing man and Atticus Finch was taking advantage of him. Trickin' lawyers like Atticus Finch took advantage of people like him all the time with their trickin' ways. He had told them what happened. He'd said it again and again, which he did. Nothing Atticus had asked him after this shook his story, that he'd looked through the window, then he ran the nigger off, then ran for the sheriff. Atticus finally dismissed him. Mr. Gilmer asked him one more question. About your writing with your left hand. Are you ambidextrous, Mr. Yule? I most positively am not. I can use one hand as good as the other. One hand as good as the other, he added, glaring at the defense table. Jem seemed to be having a quiet fit. He was pounding the balcony rail softly, and once he whispered, We've got him. I didn't think so. Atticus was trying to show, it seemed to me, that Mr. Yule could have beaten up Mayella. That much I could follow. If her right eye was blacked and she was beaten mostly on the right side of the face, it would tend to show that a left-handed person did it. Sherlock Holmes and Jem Finch would agree. But Tom Robinson could easily be left-handed too. Like Mr. Hecate, I imagined a person facing me, went through a swift mental pantomime, and concluded that he might have held her with his right hand and pounded her with his left. I looked down at him. His back was to us, but I could see his broad shoulders and bull-thick neck. He could easily have done it. I thought Jem was counting his chickens.